Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here to listen to us talk about mosquito sprays. As Rachel said, my name is Aaron Anderson. I'm on the pesticide reduction team here at Xerces, and I mostly work in residential landscapes, towns, and cities, working to reduce pesticide use and encourage pollinator-friendly landscaping and gardening practices. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about the risks of residential mosquito sprays to pollinators, with a bit about a study that we performed a few summers ago that we're finally wrapping up for publication now, which is really exciting. And of course, I want to thank Rachel and Amber for organizing this webinar. So before I begin, I do want to quickly thank our supporters, because without them, we couldn't do the work that we do. And on that note, I want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're at all interested or able, I encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll be joining really an extraordinary group of people who've shown themselves to be inquisitive, engaged, and who truly care about protecting invertebrates. And we really do rely on our members to do the work that we do. So if this is your first webinar with Xerces, we've been around since 1971 working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it lived in the coastal sand dunes around the San Francisco Bay Area. Here's a photo of it on this slide. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs focusing on pollinators, agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides. We also do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas. And this slide has some representative photos of the areas that we work in. But I think maybe the most helpful work we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting invertebrates. And you can visit our website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, other invertebrates. And this library is really decades of work, and it has fantastic resources. So I really encourage you all to go check it out at xerces.org. There's materials related to what we're talking about here today, as well as pollinator habitat plant selection, endangered species conservation, and a lot more. So definitely go check that out. Okay, so I want to give you a quick outline of where we're going with this talk today, so we're kind of all on the same page. So we'll start off talking a little bit about mosquito biology, and then talk about risks of adult mosquito sprays or adulticides, and then talk about this Xerces study that we performed looking at spray residues in residential yards, and then kind of end by talking about some ecologically responsible mosquito management solutions. But before we kind of dive into the meat of this talk, I do want to spend one slide talking about why this matters. So many of you may already be aware that many recent studies are documenting declines in insect populations and communities worldwide. In particular, many pollinators, including bees and butterflies, are imperiled. And the data is patchy since many insects, in fact, most insects, aren't carefully monitored. For example, we have about 4,000 bee species native to North America alone. But the data that we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and these other insects. And there's several causes that scientists agree on, with the largest being habitat loss. But another leading cause are pesticides, as we'll discuss, residential mosquito sprays can be a pretty big source of pesticide exposure in residential landscapes. Okay, so let's spend a few slides talking about mosquitoes, kind of where they fit in ecosystems, their biology, and their life cycle. And this is important because in order to understand how to truly manage any pest, not just mosquitoes, it's important to know how to kind of break that cycle so that the pest can't thrive. So despite the common misconception that mosquitoes are nothing but a nuisance, they actually do play some ecological roles. They're a food source for a wide range of organisms, both when they're adults and also when they're larvae. Larval mosquitoes, the immature stage, actually contribute to nutrient cycling in wetland areas. The larval stage is aquatic, it lives in water, and they eat microorganisms like algae and microbes. Some of these larvae are, of course, eaten by larval predators, but then surviving mosquitoes that fly to land are either eaten by predators like birds or bats or other insects, or they just die and decompose on land. And either way, they're contributing to the movement of nutrients from wetlands to upland areas. They're really tiny and might not seem very substantial, but there are an estimated 96 million pounds of mosquitoes that hatch each year in Alaska, for example, which is a lot of biomass. And mosquitoes are also pollinators. Although they might not pollinate at the level of bees or other types of flies, adult mosquitoes do visit flowers to sip nectar for energy. And unlike bees, they're not actively collecting pollen. This is why bees are such good pollinators. They're actively collecting and moving pollen grains. But mosquitoes do get pollen grains stuck to them and pollinate sometimes. One study in Europe, for example, found that mosquito visitation actually significantly increased seed set in tansy flowers, though I should note that other flower types in the study didn't see that significant increase in seed set. But I did want to mention this just to kind of illustrate the mosquitoes are doing more than just drinking a little bit of nectar. And there are some flowers that have actually evolved to have mosquitoes pollinate them. The blunt-leafed orchid is an example. It's found throughout the northern parts of the country, from the northeast into the northwest. And researchers have actually found that certain mosquitoes are preferentially attracted to the blunt-leafed orchid due to certain chemical compounds in its odor. And orchids that don't have that odor don't attract mosquitoes. So while they might not be a major part of pollination systems, they can play that role. I think it's something important to remember. So of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that mosquitoes can be vectors of disease that impact humans and livestock. And the concern is real with, our changing climate, expanding the range of some mosquito species, along with, international travel, potentially spreading new mosquito-borne diseases, creating, growing concern about those new diseases establishing in the U.S. And of course, existing diseases can be worrisome as well. Many of you might be familiar with, different types of encephalitis, West Nile, the concern over Zika, even dengue fever, since cases have been found in Texas, Hawaii, Florida, and some of the outlying US territories. So I want to note that we in no way want to minimize the seriousness of these diseases, nor the risk that they can pose to people. But there are many times that insecticides are used to treat mosquitoes that's unnecessary and will negatively impact the broader insect community. And there are more ecologically sound strategies that can be more effective, which we'll talk about later in this talk. I think this is also why we need to be prepared ahead so that we don't let fear drive decisions, and having a solid mosquito management plan can help reduce the potential of contracting mosquito-borne diseases. Uh, I also do want to note that not all mosquitoes are vectors of disease. There's about 176 species of mosquitoes found in North America, and I think that number is about 200 if you include those outlying US territories. And only about 12 of those 200 species actually vector or transmit diseases. The rest are just nuisances or might not even feed on mammal blood. They focus on other types of animals, and some don't even feed on blood at all. So there's a whole wide range of mosquitoes, and not all of them are disease vectors. Oops, I think there we go. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the mosquito life cycle. As I mentioned, this is important to understand how to control a pest. The adult mosquito, which is what we see buzzing around and biting us, is only one stage of their life cycle. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water, and they only need a small amount of water, about the amount in a bottle cap, to reproduce. And females typically lay about 100 eggs at a time, and adult females can lay multiple times in their lifespan. And mosquito eggs can actually stick to the edges of containers, and if the water level goes down, they can survive with no water for up to 8 months, depending on the species. And in warmer climate, this means that mosquitoes can overwinter as eggs. And once in suitable still water, eggs hatch in as soon as a few days after laying, and then their larvae, kind of represented at the bottom of this slide, or the circle, I should say, on this slide. And the larvae are aquatic, they feed on microorganisms in the water, and they develop into pupa in about 5 days or so. And then the pupa are the last stage before they become flying adults. And pupation takes only about 2 to 3 days. And then we have an adult mosquito that flies off. So if you add this all up, this means that the entire life cycle of a mosquito can take place in as few as 8 to 10 days. And with the number of eggs they lay, up to 500 for a female over her lifetime, this means they can reproduce really quickly. Uh, and you might ask why they suck our blood. Adult mosquitoes, both male and female, only eat nectar from flowers or maybe sap from plants, sugary things that provide them energy, which again is why they can serve as pollinators. Only the females feed on blood, and they need the proteins from a blood meal to produce their eggs. So male mosquitoes won't bite you. I've actually walked around a lake kind of early in the season with lots of mosquitoes rising up from the vegetation, but I think they were males since males tend to emerge earlier than females, and then none of them were biting, which was kind of an interesting experience. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about mosquito control. We'll touch on the issues with pesticide-intensive management at home, including some data from this recent study that we led here at Xerces. Okay, so I want to start with a quick background about mosquito treatments in residential areas and the types of sprays that are frequently used. And there's largely two types, and these are barrier sprays in home yards and sprays or fogging performed by mosquito control districts or vector control districts. This spraying for adult mosquitoes is called adulticiding. So the main types of chemicals used for these sprays tend to be pyrethroids. They're the most commonly used pesticide for these residential mosquito sprays. And as a group, these are really highly toxic insecticides that kill more than just mosquitoes. They're broad spectrum, which means they kill all sorts of other invertebrates as well. Pyrethroids are related to pyrethrins, which are naturally occurring toxins that are found in some chrysanthemum flowers. But pyrethroids are synthetic versions that are similar in structure, but are often much more toxic and much more persistent, which means they last longer in the environment than pyrethrins, which I should note can be quite toxic as well. So these include, but aren't limited to, bifenthrin, deltamethrin, permethrin. These are pesticide names you might see and are often active ingredients used by various mosquito spray companies. Compounds called synergists are also sometimes added, and these are chemicals that are added to the pesticide mixture that actually increase the toxicity of the insecticides, which are already quite potent. And the risks to insects can vary. The biggest impact is likely to the insects that are out flying or out crawling on plants when these sprays happen and get contacted directly by the application spray or fog. But there's some species that might crawl a lot on treated plants, which might increase their exposure risk. And the persistence of these chemicals varies from, days to weeks, some can linger for months. This means that they can really linger on these plant surfaces and create an extra risk, in particular to those insects like butterflies and moths, since the caterpillars of these species feed on leaf tissue. If that leaf is contaminated with pyrethroids, that's obviously a huge risk. And even if sprays happen in the evening or in early morning, there's many different insects that are active at those times of days who can be exposed. And again, this won't be protective if that spray is designed to last for weeks, because all sorts of organisms will continue to move and eat on these plants. Okay, so let's talk about these home yard barrier sprays. How these pesticides are applied varies between application method, and for these barrier sprays, these are typically sprayed by private companies that advertise their services to homeowners, and they typically spray a pyrethroid or a mix of pyrethroids, and they'll also sometimes include those synergists that increase the toxicity. And applicators spray these with a larger droplet size that are designed to both kill mosquitoes in the air and where they're roosting in vegetation, and then coat the leaves and remain as a barrier that they claim is both repellent and toxic for up to 3 weeks, after which they recommend they come back and reapply. But that vegetation is also where other insects are often hanging out, either herbivores, predators, pollinators visiting flowers, and even species like fireflies often roost in these areas during the day. And here's a photo of an applicator applying a barrier spray along a property line. This is actually from a trail camera from the property of one of our studied participants. So on the other hand, vector control districts, which are tasked with managing mosquitoes on a more community-wide level, mostly use what are called ultra-low volume or ULV sprays. And these sprayers aerosolize pesticides so that they can disperse widely through an area using super small droplet sizes so that the pesticides kind of hang in the air, can travel pretty far. Again, they're most often pyrethroids, though in some places they still use organophosphates, which are another highly toxic group of insecticides. These sprays typically are either performed using with trucks, like in this photo here, but in some places aerial sprays from airplanes also happen. And depending on the location and the district, these will happen at the town level, some are at the county level. This can kind of vary by state and municipality. And in some locations, the municipality contracts this out to private companies. I also want to mention that vector control districts will often use what are called larvicides to treat water to kill larval mosquitoes. And this can be a good part of a mosquito management plan, but isn't what we're really talking about when we're discussing mosquito sprays in this talk. Just kind of wanted to mention that. Okay, so what do these mosquito sprays mean for pollinators? So we know that there are risks from these sprays. We know that the pesticides used are broadly toxic and are applied in an indiscriminate manner. There hasn't been a lot of research about barrier spray toxicity to beneficial insects, but one study did find that monarch caterpillars that were fed leaves treated by one of these barrier sprays had much lower survival rates for up to 3 weeks than caterpillars that were fed uncontaminated leaves. For vector control district sprays, we do have documented die-off events after these sprays, like a monarch die-off recorded after a vector control district spray in South Dakota, and a honeybee die-off after a vector control district spray in South Carolina. But in general, the known risks aren't super well quantified. So with that in mind, I want to share a quick story that kind of helped inspire our study. One of our Xerces members sent us this video. She had observed a mosquito spray service coming to her neighbor's yard every 2 weeks, and the spraying was drifting up as the applicator was applying it and traveling to her yard. So I'll play this video really quickly. So keep an eye on the middle of the video where you can see a mosquito spray company employee and then a little bit in, you can kind of see this visible plume of spray. So let me hit play here. So you can see how that plume was really going up, getting, the tops of the vegetation, and even was making that tree kind of sway with the pesticide application. It was really kind of going everywhere. So you know, she was wondering how far these applications drift and what the risk was to the plants in her yard and the insects in her yard. So she reported this incident, and the state agricultural department actually responded and tested her plants, which tested positive for bifenthrin residue, which is the pesticide that the mosquito spray company was spraying. So because of this and because of her documentation, the company was fined and committed to better training of applicators, which is nice. And she also had a conversation with her neighbor who ended up stopping spraying and started using some of the ecologically friendly mosquito control methods that we'll talk about later. And anecdotally, she said that she saw much more insect life in her yard after this. So hopefully this was a lesson learned both for the spray company and the neighbor as well. So I just kind of wanted to share that story and that visual of what these sprays can look like. But yeah, this question of risk from neighboring sprays is a question that we get often, which was the catalyst for conducting our study in the summer of 2023. People will ask us, I'm creating pollinator habitat in my yard, but my neighbor sprays for mosquitoes, and wonder if they shouldn't be creating habitat because of these mosquito sprays. The worry is that these yards will be what's called an ecological trap, which is essentially luring pollinators into what appears to be really high quality habitat when it's actually going to be really poor quality and toxic to them. And we didn't really have a great answer to that question, and wanted to get a sense of, what are the risk of these backyard mosquito sprays to pollinators? So we decided to sample backyards, neighboring yards that were sprayed for mosquitoes to see how much insecticide residue was deposited and what insecticides were present. Okay, so here's a quick summary of the experiment. So to answer that question, we tried to recruit volunteers who have a neighbor who hires a backyard service so that we could sample their adjacent yard, just similar to that video that I showed you. But in recruiting for these volunteers, we unexpectedly found 4 volunteers who do hire one of these services. So we got to include those as a data point, which was honestly very exciting and really got us more information for this study. And yes, we also found people who received vector control district sprays in their yards, because that's a similar question that people often have. What are the impact of these vector control district sprays on the insect life in their yards? And then we had the volunteers hang monitors in the yard to collect pesticides, and then we had these monitors analyzed. Okay, so given all that, these were kind of the main research questions. Our questions were how much residue is deposited from private mosquito sprays? How much residue drifts from neighbors' applications? How much residue results from mosquito control district sprays? And then finally, kind of the crux of this, what risk do any detected residues actually pose to pollinators and other invertebrates? So for volunteer recruitment, first we wanted to locate locations where mosquito sprays are quite common. We also needed partners to reach potential volunteers. So with that in mind, we worked with Decatur, Georgia, who's a really rock star Bee City USA affiliate, which is an arm of Xerces, doing really wonderful work to reduce residential mosquito spraying in their community. And we also recruited volunteers from Massachusetts through my colleague Rosemary's contacts in the state. And then finally, we chose Iowa, partnering with Good Neighbor Iowa to use their volunteer network. We decided to use silicone bands as monitors to collect pesticides, as opposed to sampling vegetation in yards, which is something we've done for some previous Xerces sampling studies. Vegetation was our first idea because of that, but in a yard, it would be really impossible to sample all leaves from a similar distance from where sprays were occurring, and different leaves might have different characteristics that also might change how these sprays adhere to them. If you think about like a waxy magnolia leaf versus a really fuzzy lamb's ear covered in fuzzy hairs, we might expect the residues to collect on these leaves differently. So these bands are really great because they capture all sorts of chemicals. They first started being used in human and environmental toxicology experiments, like having firefighters or roofers wear them for a week to see what chemicals they're exposed to. But recently, they've been being used more and more in pesticide monitoring and ecological studies. And what's really nice is that they're a consistent material and surface, unlike plants, and we could have volunteers place them consistently in the same locations in their yard. Okay, so again, we have 3 different groups of spray types. We have that drift from neighbor spray, we have people who actually hire a spray service themselves, and we have municipal control district sprays or vector control district sprays. So this is how we had volunteers place bans. So for spray drift, we had volunteers place 2 bands along their property line, from that property line where the spray is coming from, 1/3 kind of up from the upper and lower edge of the property, and then a third band in the middle about 20 feet back. And here's my kind of attempt at illustrating this using clip art or Microsoft Word. So for band placement for people who hired a spray service themselves, we asked them to place two bands on opposite edges of the property and then a third band in the center of the yard. And then finally, the band placement for the mosquito control district sprays is similar to the one for the neighbor drift, where we asked them to place bands about one-third of the way from each property edge along the roadside where the spray would be coming from, and then a third band in the middle, again, about 20 feet back. So for the actual procedure of deploying the bands, we had volunteers hang them on hooked wires. We just bent pin flag wires with the flag stripped off, just those little flags that are used to mark things like irrigation. And the volunteers then hung them on these bands, on these wires, and placed them in their yards before a known spray event, and then collected them the next day after the spray had dried. And we did this to try and capture just the spray event as much as possible. We didn't want a different pesticide application to contaminate the bands, as unlikely as that may have been. So then we had volunteers wrap the bands in foil, put them in a Ziploc bag, and store them in their freezer until a point person collected them and overnight shipped them to the lab where they were analyzed for over 300 different pesticide compounds. And this image shows a band hanging on a hook there. And then here are a few photos of the bands in the field in Massachusetts, Georgia, and Iowa. I mark them with arrows because they kind of blend in, which is a good and bad thing. There might have been less vandalism of people picking them out of yards with them blending in, but we did lose a band or two to a lawnmower. So if we do a project like this again with bands in yards, maybe keeping the flags on the pin flag wires next time might be a good idea. But you can see these bands here in the yards marked with the arrows. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the results that we found. Okay, so here are some quick summary statistics. So overall, we sampled 26 sites, 78 bands. 13 sites were sites that experienced neighbor drift. Four of the sites hired a spray service to spray their yard. Seven of the sites were sprayed by a vector control district spray. And then we also had two control sites. Overall, we detected 12 insecticides, 8 fungicides, and 1 synergist. This was kind of outside of the scope of our study, but we did detect 8 fungicides that were all in samples from Iowa. Our study wasn't designed to investigate this, so I don't want to make assumptions, but it was an interesting observation. This may be because of the surrounding landscape context being heavily agricultural, but not something that we could really investigate. But I thought it was an interesting observation that someday if we could do a study where we're just putting bands up in yards, detecting what's there, it could be an interesting thing to follow up on. Okay, so what did we find specifically? We found 5 pyrethroids, all presumably sprayed for mosquito control purposes. The pyrethroid bifenthrin was in 53 out of 70 non-control samples, sometimes in really high levels. It was obviously what was really being applied, and other times it was at much lower levels, and whether that was from background contamination or from residue in the applicator's tanks, it's hard to know, but it was interesting how relatively ubiquitous it was across these sites. It was even detected on one control band, while the other control bands had no pesticides detected. We also detected a good amount of piperonal butoxide, or PBO, which is a synergist that, again, increases the toxicity of pyrethroids. And we found it both in home sprays and also in vector control district sprays. We found 3 insect growth regulators, which it sounds like from my research, some private spray companies include to also try to kill immature mosquitoes. But of course, they also do impact all sorts of other insects as well. We found 2 neonicotinoids. These were likely not part of the mosquito sprays, but it was still good to note that they were found in the landscape. Okay, so the next question, what did we find per site? So for the number of insecticides per site, we found an average of just over 4 compounds per actively sprayed yard. We found just over one compound on average per yard experiencing that neighbor drift, and we found about two compounds per mosquito control district sprayed yard. Sometimes there were multiple pyrethroids in similar amounts, indicating that mixtures of these were being sprayed. So for the amount, just the actual amount of insecticides that were deposited on these bands, we had 1,563 nanograms per gram of band in sprayed yards, 28.6 nanograms per gram in neighbor drift yards, and 7.3 nanograms per gram in mosquito control district sprayed yards. So these raw numbers are really hard to interpret and don't mean much without context. But the takeaway here is that yards directly sprayed had a lot of insecticides. Yards with neighbor drift had several orders of magnitude less on average, and then vector control district sprayed yards had the lowest average amount. But we did want to try to figure out what these numbers mean in a real world sense. We did some math to try to go from how much pesticide residue was sprayed on these bands to how much would be sprayed on a hypothetical bee sitting on that location, experiencing those sprays. And we used the non-native honeybee, Apis mellifera, as our model because unfortunately, pesticide toxicity isn't known for most of our native bee species. In fact, kind of as an aside here, that's a huge data gap and a challenge with our work. How most pesticides impact most of our native pollinator species isn't known. So we have to rely on proxy species like the honeybee, even though our native species are often more sensitive to these pesticides. But we have to work with the data we have, which is why we use the honeybee for these calculations. So we compared what we found to what's called the lethal dose, 50, the LD50, the amount of pesticides that kills 50% of a population in lab studies. And what we found was that yards directly sprayed by these barrier spray services had an average of 6.6 times the LD50, which is the amount of pyrethroids that are toxic to honeybees. The yards with the highest values were over 34 and 24 times that lethal dose. Yards with neighbor drift had much lower on average, 0.12, so about 12% of that lethal dose. But the highest level we found in a neighbor drift yard was 2 times the lethal dose. So the potential for acute risk is there. We also did more analysis that I don't have time to kind of go into in this talk, but we looked at lower levels of risk and we found that about a third of the neighbor sprayed yards had the potential for some level of risk to pollinators. Municipal sprays were lower, these mosquito spray districts, with an average of 0.03 times the honeybee LD50, with the highest being 0.13, or 13%. So for our high-level results, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this study is that spraying a yard for mosquitoes carries very high risk to other invertebrates. The fact that we found 24 and 34 times the honeybee LD50 in two different yards was pretty astounding. I do want to note that overall our sample size is small, and there can be variations in applications and approaches. And there, of course, was variability in the amount of residue that we found on bands within these yards. So we can't say this is representative for every hired spray, but it's certainly concerning. Uh, Second, your neighbor spraying for mosquitoes shouldn't preclude you from creating habitat, but it does have the potential to carry real risk and the potential for concerning levels of contamination. So mitigation of some sort is still very important to reduce this risk. And this could be as simple as talking to your neighbors to change their practices, like the Xerces member I mentioned in the example. Um, or perhaps it's placing your pollinator habitat on the other side of a yard from a neighbor who sprays. Or creating a drift buffer by planting non-flowering shrubs like arborvitae, which will intercept some of that drifting pesticide spray. You don't want to install a fence for this. Drift hitting a hard surface like a fence can actually cause it to kind of stop and be forced up and over that barrier. So counterintuitively, something that can allow some airflow through it, but still kind of capture those pesticide droplets is actually more effective. Yeah, so considering some of these mitigation strategies, is definitely important if your neighbor sprays for mosquitoes. The vector control district sprays did result in less residue, which is encouraging. We're glad we didn't see these really high, potentially acute levels of contamination from these sprays. But again, I do want to note that approaches between districts can vary, and we don't want to overassume the safety of these sprays. We only sampled a small number of sites, and between districts, there might be differences in insecticide used, equipment used, calibration, and all of that could impact risk. And as I mentioned, we do know from incident reports and studies there have been kills from control district sprays. So we still want to focus on the most effective way to control mosquitoes, which isn't spraying for adults. It's early intervention. It's much easier to control mosquitoes when they're larvae. We don't want to wait until mosquitoes are flying to control them. And we'll talk about that more in just a slide or two. And furthermore, and these are things that are applicable to all of these spray types, contamination below those lethal levels can still be very harmful. And there are almost certainly impacts at these lower levels of contamination that are also concerning. These could be things like decreased reproduction in a pollinator, decreased foraging success, delayed development. These are all things that might not kill an individual pollinator, but can add up over time to impact their populations. There's also likely chronic or long-term impacts on these long-lived individuals and populations over time. If these sprays are happening, bi-weekly to every 3 weeks from potentially March into November, depending on your location, this chronic exposure, this time over time exposure, even at low levels, might carry extra risk. I just want to stress that our samples are just one snapshot in time. Okay, so now that we've talked about the downside of chemical mosquito control, what can you do to help manage mosquitoes at home? So the number one thing you can do is to simply eliminate standing water, also called source reduction. This removes the breeding habitat for mosquitoes and is the most effective thing you can do. And it's imperative to start doing this early because this will help keep mosquito populations from building. As we talked about earlier, they lay hundreds of eggs and they only need the amount of water that's in the bottle cap to reproduce. So it's really important to be diligent about this. The adults lay their eggs in still water. They only need 8 to 10 days. So water that stands around for just over a week can really lead to a population explosion. So I'd recommend dumping water from buckets and trash cans. Look for hidden flower pots or old tires that might have filled with rain. It's also a great idea to check your gutters to see if they're clogged, because that can be a surprise, unseen source of stagnant water. And finally, every few days, dump and refill water sources like pet bowls and bird baths to prevent any mosquito larvae from completing their life cycle. You can even look for places like driveway potholes to fill in or depressions in your lawn that you can raise because these can harbor puddles that mosquitoes can utilize as breeding habitat. If you have a backyard pond, you can manage it to better support natural enemies that will feed on mosquitoes. So by including diverse plantings to provide habitat for larval predators like dragonflies and damselflies, you can help control these larval mosquito populations. These species all have the same basic needs. They just need clean water, food, and habitat that serves as a refuge to mate and reproduce. This is getting a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but we do have resources for managing backyard ponds for dragonflies and damselflies available at our online Xerces library, including really detailed instructions about pond construction, location, plant choice. So if that's relevant to you, please do check out that resource. And if you have a kind of a permanent human constructed body of water, simply adding a small water feature like a waterfall, or even just a small pump to keep the water moving a little bit is all that's needed to make your pond inhospitable to mosquitoes. If you do use an open water pump, it's a good idea to add some protective screening to it, since these pumps can pull in dragonfly and damselfly nymphs and kill them. And obviously you want to try to protect those species. I wanted to quickly touch on mosquito buckets and BT dunks that you can buy and use at home. For those of you unfamiliar with this, this is a strategy that's sometimes recommended to control mosquitoes in your yard by adding water and some organic matter to a bucket, which will then attract female mosquitoes to the bucket where they'll lay their eggs. And often people recommend adding what's called a BT mosquito dunk to the water to kill mosquitoes. And the active ingredient in these dunks is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a species of bacteria that lives in the soil and is often used as an insecticide. And there's a strain used in these pucks that you place in water that dissolve that are marketed as only killing mosquitoes. And while these dunks are fairly targeted, they actually do kill all flies in the suborder that mosquitoes are in. So that includes things like shore flies, crane flies, midges, not just mosquitoes. And these insects do play, other important roles in ecosystems, and we'd like to not impact them if possible. And we also don't know what the effects that these dunks might have on things like soil insects and soil biota when the water's dumped. So while this isn't the biggest concern in the world, if you do want to make one of these mosquito bucket traps, we'd recommend you just dump the water out weekly, since that will also kill the mosquito larvae and prevent them from developing into adults. Um, but your situation might vary, of course. If you're leaving for a long trip or something, there might be occasions that you'd want to use one of these products. We just recommend kind of working through almost an integrated pest management framework first, where you're trying to do strategies that are less reliant on pesticides before moving on to something like a BT dunk, which, while not the most impactful insecticide to non-targets, it still has some potential non-target concerns. So beyond getting rid of standing water, there are other preventative measures you can take to avoid being bitten. Protect yourself from bites by wearing long sleeves when mosquitoes are active and using a repellent. You should also make sure that your window screens are intact so that mosquitoes can't come indoors. If you want to use your porch or patio on a kind of mosquito-y evening, you should consider putting out a fan when you're sitting outside because mosquitoes can't fly even in very light winds. So that's a good way to keep your porch or patio mosquito free. So these all might sound really simple or obvious, but they do work. So here's a quick success story in mosquito vector disease management that does highlight the importance of prevention at home. So during a 2003 West Nile virus outbreak in Colorado, researchers surveyed residents in both Fort Collins and Loveland, a town just south of Fort Collins, and marked both of those on that map with a star. And they found that Fort Collins residents were much more likely to implement personal protective measures, like wearing long sleeves, applying repellent, and avoiding outdoor activities when mosquitoes are active. And despite the fact that Fort Collins actually had a greater abundance of mosquitoes and more West Nile positive mosquitoes compared to Loveland, Fort Collins had half as many incidences of severe disease, likely because the community was using these preventative measures. So I mentioned that mosquitoes are best controlled at the community level, so it's important to do your part and eliminate that standing water, which will hopefully give you some population reduction in your own yard. But mosquitoes are mobile, and no matter what you do, if your neighbor has great mosquito habitat, you'll see adult mosquitoes looking for blood meals in your yard. So what can you do to scale up to the neighborhood and community level? So at the neighborhood and community level, there's a lot of grassroots things you can do, and I want to highlight Decatur again as a great example of this. Again, they're part of the Xerces Bee City USA program, in which affiliate communities make commitments to protect pollinators. And one of these is pesticide reduction, and Decatur has done a lot of outreach on mosquito spraying. They don't have a vector control district that sprays, and in turn, many residents instead hire these private spray companies. Um, and to kind of combat this, Decatur, as they call themselves, added information on residential mosquito spraying on their Bee City website, developed literature to hand out, and created large mosquito spraying kills bees branded signs to put out in yards that look like that. And as part of their public education campaign, they use social media, they table at events like farmers markets or nurseries, do presentations to neighborhood associations and community groups, and they also work with the city's Environmental Sustainability Board. So I think this is a really kind of inspiring way that this community is doing outreach, education, and even working on policy targeted at reducing pesticide use in their community. And then scaling up, as we've discussed, Local vector control districts or municipalities are in charge of managing mosquito populations on public lands and coordinating community-wide responses. A lot of them do fantastic work, and I'll give a few examples on the next slide. But in other cases, management plans might be lacking. And I want to emphasize that, we're very aware of disease risks and not trying to minimize them, but there are ways to manage mosquitoes that are more effective without relying primarily on these toxic adulticides. As a quick general summary, a good mosquito control district program involves investing in public education and communication to make sure everyone knows what they can do to stay safe, healthy, and reduce mosquito populations at home through some of the common sense methods we've talked about today. And it should also involve active monitoring of mosquitoes and thresholds for tolerance, in particular for disease incidents and populations of those mosquito species that are the ones that are actually responsible for vectoring diseases. High populations of other mosquito species might be a nuisance, but they're not what should be triggering these chemical treatments. And when diseases are found at concerning levels and the municipality decides to treat, we encourage ecologically responsible interventions, such as only treating waterways where disease-carrying mosquitoes are found and using least toxic options. So with all of this in mind, if you want to get involved at the community level, the first step is to learn what is happening in your area and find out if your county or town has a mosquito management plan. And if so, does it include these kind of concepts we were just talking about? We have a resource that kind of helps walk you through taking action called Help Your Community Create an Effective Mosquito Management Plan, which is available at our Xerces website. And I encourage you all to look at that. So a quick example, the city of Boulder, Colorado is a great success story of how this can work ideally. As I mentioned a few slides ago, in 2003, there was an epidemic of West Nile virus in Colorado, and Boulder came up with a holistic, ecologically friendly management program. Many municipalities routinely sprayed insecticides to control adult mosquitoes, while Boulder was able to not spray these adulticides at all. Instead, they monitored and identified locations that harbored the mosquito species that actually vector West Nile in the city, and didn't treat locations where these mosquitoes weren't present. And they used larvicides to only treat the locations with the disease vectoring mosquito species present. And now they continuously monitor for the presence of West Nile. And when mosquitoes test positive, the city increases efforts to eliminate standing water and to expand public outreach to involve the whole community in preventative measures. So this is an example of how a control district can use a holistic approach, excuse me, to control disease, vectoring mosquitoes, while also minimizing toxic insecticide use. So I do want to end here just by mentioning that a great reason to be focused on protecting our yards and our parks from pesticides is that our residential areas, urban areas, including parks and our yards, really hold more potential for bee conservation than previously thought. Studies have found cities to have surprisingly diverse and relatively intact pollinator communities, and they can even have higher bee diversities than the surrounding landscape, particularly when that landscape is heavily agricultural. So these residential areas that we live and play in can really function as refuges for insects and other animals like birds, even at the single site level, like a yard or a park. But together, all of these sites can kind of scale up and provide connected and functional habitat across the landscape. But these areas need to be managed properly, and that includes protecting them from the pesticides that are often used in urban areas. And I want to quickly note that we have a variety of resources related to this topic that are available online at our Xerces website. Here's a few that are particularly relevant. And we also have other resources for community pesticide reduction. So I encourage you to all go to the library at the Xerces site and look through them. And on that note, I think we have some time for questions, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And thank you all again for being here for this talk.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I feel like I need to get like a sound clip of applause. That was really wonderful. It was a lot of good information. We have a lot of questions. I'm glad. We are going to go a little bit over the hour today. So if you're able to stick around, we'll try to get to all of them. I'm not sure we will, but we're going to just start off by answering the very first question we got. Lisa, Canada, also an ambassador. Hi, Lisa. Could someone please clarify how mosquito coils or mosquito candles are viewed as a repellent or as a pesticide? We do actually get that question a lot, so that's why I thought we'd start with that one.
You know, I typed in an answer, so I'll just kind of briefly, it's tricky because repellents actually are pesticides in the regulatory sense. So, but coils are stated to both repel and kill mosquitoes, and they do use the ingredients in them that are put in those coils oftentimes are designed to kill insects, which means they could also be harmful to other insects. There's risk of inhalation for humans as well. The candles, the ones that I know about from and I did a quick search while we were waiting, they're mostly essential oils, and they truly are designed to repel those mosquitoes. So candles, coils, very different.
Yeah, the coils often do have like pyrethroids, right? Which is what we were talking about in this talk, and you're burning them, so it's definitely a potential source of risk.
Much smaller contained space, but
Yeah.
many people put them near where they're sitting, right? And so they're inhaling it, and it's that immediate surrounding potentially could have settling out. It's also very interesting because there's not a lot of study on what happens exactly to the toxicity of these chemicals when with the change in temperature. Some chemicals are going to increase in toxicity with that temperature change. Yeah, different dynamic.
Thanks for that, both of you. Yeah, so many good questions. Before we get into some of the more specific ones, we had a couple people who were interested in a few more details about this study, specifically more information about the control site and average lot size and whether lots or neighboring yards were upwind or downwind when you were surveying for drift.
Yeah, so for the control sites, the goal was to have a control yard in each of these states that we sampled. Unfortunately, the challenge with working with volunteers is and the volunteers were fantastic. I can't thank them all enough for participating. But sometimes people drop out for different reasons, and so we did lose one of our control sites. But the two sites that were our control sites, they did not have mosquito sprays anywhere nearby that they knew of. And we found no pesticides on those control bands, except for one band. We did detect small levels of bifenthrin on it. We also used what were called trip check controls, we selected one person in each state to do these trip check controls, which essentially just were making sure there was no contamination in the kind of handling process. So these people got this extra band mailed to them. They handled it like the other bands, except they just didn't put them out in their yard. And then they packaged them up in the freezer, and the band was analyzed in the lab, and we found no pesticide contamination on those trip check controls, which was good. It showed that there was no source of contamination kind of in handling or transit. Yeah, so that was the control question. I'm not sure if that answered the question fully. The other question was upwind or downwind. Yeah, so there's a lot of site level variables that we didn't have a big enough. We would need a really large sample size to begin to looking at some of the things like, lot size, upwind, downwind, whether there's, obstructions in the way, things like that. So we weren't able to account for that in our study, but that is, I think something that would be very interesting to know, where it's like if the wind is blowing and the applicators are applying even when they shouldn't be in kind of a windy situation, how does that impact the amount of pesticides that are being deposited? There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, I think, with how these mosquito sprays might be impacting neighboring yards, and hopefully more studies. This can kind of serve as a launching point for more investigation in the future.
And then the last one was kind of about control for lot size. And while we didn't control for lot size, we did control for the distance from the neighbor. Well, or distance into their lot. So it was 20 feet in.
Two of the bands were right on that edge, and then one was 20 feet back. And what was interesting is we didn't actually see a significant difference between that 20-foot back band and the ones on the edges. They were all contaminated with relatively similar amounts of pesticides.
And we should clarify, though, that it was tricky how to describe these different lots, but the neighboring lot is not necessarily adjacent. Sometimes they were across the street or a little bit further away. So it wasn't necessarily immediately adjacent, that neighbor. So it was how far did this move into your yard, not from how far it came.
All right, we have a couple product specific questions. Kathy wants to know, did this study include sprays that homeowners can buy at any store? So I guess that's kind of a double question if these companies were possibly using something that people could just go buy, like Yard Guard, for example.
Yeah, so in our study, we didn't include people who were applying products themselves. We only included people who were hiring one of these professional services to come spray their yards. And we quizzed them as far as they knew. It was tricky when it was the neighbor because, in a few cases, people had a good enough relationship with their neighbor that they actually had conversations and said, "Hey, I'm doing this study. Like, do you know what your person's spraying? When are they coming?" Other times, people didn't have that relationship, but we tried to figure out what they were spraying as much as possible because you're right, sometimes there's these essential oil sprays that are used instead. But my understanding is that's a pretty small minority of the applications that these companies do. But for most of the cases that we know about, they were spraying pyrethroids and yeah, using these barrier sprays.
Okay, great. Another specific one. The brand Thermacell uses 5.5 metofluthrin. I hope I'm saying that correctly. They claim to be safe for people and pets, but I assume this is harmful to pollinators, especially considering that it permeates a 20-foot zone. And we had a couple people interested in Thermacell specifically.
I could start this one, Erin.
Sure, go for it, MA. Yeah.
So I do feel like, I mean, you can't advertise any pesticides are safe. The thermocells are really in similar products are interesting in that they are, putting these chemicals, these are pyrethroids as well, that Amber was talking about, and releasing them into the air. They're not a spray, but it is still, and it also, again, is heating it up similar to a coil. We did not study this risk, although I think there's probably worth us questioning what would be the impact when you're inhaling that, what's the impact of what settles out into the environment with these, because it is the same chemicals that are being used to kill the mosquitoes. So and some of them, some of the reading about it I think it makes it a little bit confusing for folks and the consumer to buy. So I'm glad you asked the question. And I do think it's something we need to know more about. Erin, anything else? Did I answer the question?
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
So this is a question we get often from folks. And if anyone is listening to Bug Banter, our podcast, we had Erin on earlier, and this is a question that we had asked. But some mosquito spray services market a treatment as somehow being environmentally friendly. And so there's kind of two parts to this question. One, is it actually effective against mosquitoes? And two, are they actually environmentally friendly?
Yeah, and I think as I kind of answered in the Bug Banter podcast, Rachel, I do want to mention that I sometimes hear two versions of this. One is that spray by one of these pesticide companies is being advertised as being natural when they're really spraying pyrethroids. They're just using the fact that they're kind of related to pyrethrum or pyrethrins, which are these naturally occurring substances. Sometimes they might be actually using pyrethrums, but they'll claim that they're natural and derived from flowers, and that truth is stretched a little bit, and people will think that it's this natural thing when it's really this highly toxic insecticide that's being sprayed. But then, yeah, a lot of these companies will offer these essential oil sprays. I've heard of oregano, garlic, peppermint, things like that. And I've done a good bit of digging, and May, please chime in here if you know something I don't. But I can't find a lot that shows that they're really all that effective against mosquitoes, and it seems like their value is likely more in being a repellent, though how long that repellency lasts isn't super obvious. And yeah, they're lower risk for sure, but they do still pose some level of toxicity to larvae of bees and other insects. And because they repel mosquitoes, essential oils studies have found that they may also repel pollinators from visiting flowers. Um, so, so I think I hope that answers the question. I think that they're certainly lower risk, but if you're paying a lot of money for these services, there's not a lot of documentation that you're going to have like a really great reduction in mosquitoes from using these products. Um, yeah, and I think that it's kind of important to keep in mind, again, that spraying for these adult mosquitoes, you know, isn't the most effective way to control mosquitoes, and more effective management options that we talked about, controlling or removing standing water, is a kind of more ecologically minded way to do this, even when you're considering a least toxic option.
I don't think I have anything to add. Yeah, sometimes they're spinning it. It's a synthetic that is similar to a natural toxin, and they spin it so it sounds like it's natural. That's tricky and that's confusing to people. And sometimes they are selling a natural product that probably may not kill these mosquitoes, but might repel them and also repel some of your pollinators as well.
Yeah, thanks. This is a great segue. We had a couple people who were specifically asking about garlic spray, also citronella candles, but wondering if the garlic spray, if there's anything wrong with using that. Anecdotally, they think that it seems to work to reduce mosquitoes on their patio.
I was actually going to say, I've heard anecdotally that the garlic spray can also be helpful. So we're building that knowledge. So garlic can be anecdotally helpful or can repel. The one thing I would say about these products, and I mean, this is sort of like the BT, right? Where you seek out the best option, and pesticides sometimes end up fitting into your solution, and sometimes you can get to a solution before you get to the pesticides. The thing I worry about with even some of these natural products is there's a lot of other ingredients added as well. And sometimes when you're spraying something, especially if you're spraying it in your yard to knock down a mosquito, the adjuvants and the other ingredients that are added can also be harmful. They may not be toxic, but they could, what I say, gum up the works. They can be very sticky to make it bind. And by binding, it might make it harder for pollinators to fly. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can cause harm. Sometimes the harm is worth if you've got triple E or you've got other disease issues right in your area and you're worried, but you make the choice, right? And so like if you're thinking, is it a nuisance? Is it something I can deal with on my own with my neighbors and without spraying? So yeah, not a lot of knowledge about the risk, still always being cognizant that what risk might be there. Making the choice that works.
You. I mean, a couple of people ask about if there are any harmful effects from aerosol mosquito sprays that used on humans rather than landscape. So if you're going out on a hike and you're putting on some spray, is there a way to do it that would be less impactful? Is it really not a concern because it's such a small scale?
So there are actually like little emitters that people now have apparently when they're walking and they're emitting an insecticide. I haven't used them. I definitely hike up in the mountains in the summer where it is absolutely beautiful and it's absolutely full of mosquitoes. I try to keep moving at a pace that they don't keep up with me. And I use repellents on my clothes. I'm not a fan of emitting a pesticide. Yeah, but I don't think there's a lot of research into it. And again, it's not an easy. Aaron, do you have anything to add on that one? The
No, I think
repellents definitely work. I'm not getting bit, so.
Yeah.
Okay, then moving on a little bit, if mosquito dunks are not so great, what can folks use in rain barrels?
So what I've suggested in the past is simply covering the rain barrel top or any opening with like a mosquito mesh, which is fine enough to exclude those adult mosquitoes. I know there's some products that you can purchase online that do that. And there's also rain barrels that you can purchase that will fill directly from the downspout, and they don't have openings that mosquitoes can actually access. And I think another strategy that I've heard people talk about is just transferring water from your rain barrel to a closed container immediately after a rain event, and periodically kind of cleaning the inside of the barrel. I know that one's a little bit more work, but those are some suggestions that I have that avoid the use of those mosquito dunks.
And I would only just add, because I know, we all have our own thresholds of acceptance, and maybe Aaron and I are going to go to a layer more extreme because this is our world, it's our passion. We're like pretty excited about this, and we're going to take as many steps as possible to step away from chemicals. You might very well in your rain barrel also check it. If you, the moment you see larva, then it's also time where you could be like, okay, I have larva and I haven't been able to effectively get rid of it on my own. This is the time I want to use a dunk. And it's not yet too late. If you're checking regularly, you can still knock down that larva. So find the threshold that works for you. As long as you're being thoughtful about how you get there, then it's the right choice.
All right, this is one of the questions I made that you had marked from Carol. Is the amount of pesticides you found from MSD enough to reliably kill mosquitoes?
Because I don't know the answer. I actually had the same question. So if you've got your mosquito control district, and we found really low levels in these yards. Aaron went through quite a rigmarole to be able to figure out how to convert a band to the amount that would be exposed on a bee, like what amount of the bee would be covered, and breaking this all down. I don't know that we went through that to figure out if the amount that landed in the yards would be effective.
No,
Aaron?
that's honestly a really good question.
I
I'm
wondered.
don't know what the kind of published toxicity data is for mosquitoes and some of these products, but that sounds like a fun little project to dig into. Yeah.
He thinks it sounds fun. I think it sounds daunting. That's good. So yeah, it's a great question, because if we're doing these treatments and yet we're not actually knocking down the species, and yet we're potentially, I don't know. So it's sorry, we don't have the answer.
No, that's okay.
Good question.
Yeah, definitely worth looking into, but not to worry. Okay, moving on, we still have a couple more questions. Wendy asks, are there any studies of the impact of using these methods on the invasive Asian tiger mosquitoes? They're in New Jersey, and these Asian tiger mosquitoes have made being outside during the day just miserable.
I was gonna start, but Aaron, I think you might also have other insights. So mosquito life cycle is pretty similar between all the different species we were talking about. Asian tiger mosquitoes are vector. They do vector disease. The one thing, so yes, the definitely source, and managing that breeding habitat, knocking and pulling out water is huge, very helpful. One thing also to know about the Asian tiger mosquito is they really don't fly very far. Like maybe they'll go a half mile. Generally, they're only going a couple hundred yards. So if you have Asian tiger mosquitoes, they're right in your neighborhood. And if they do breed in both natural and man-made containers. So the more you and your neighbors can be working to avoid any of the man-made areas where the mosquitoes might be breeding, the better. It is really hard when you have, I think someone in the chat was talking about actually having a lot of wetlands in the area. That makes it a lot trickier. And that's really working with your county, your city, the municipality to be doing the best job possible to be managing and targeted in how they are managing. But so the one quick thing is, yes, this can be effective. These techniques are also effective. And since they fly such short distances, great time to work with your neighbors and your community to knock down the areas where they might be breeding as early as possible. Some mosquitoes can fly miles and miles, and it makes it a lot harder.
Thank you both. Okay, we have 2 more questions that we're going to get to. Denise is wondering about legislation and if there's anything that people can do to sort of help stop these companies or maybe reduce spraying on a citywide level. I know that policy is something that, you know, at the Xerces Society we do work towards. So what would you recommend to folks that are frustrated by this? Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I think, you know, one of some of the things we touched on today is how confusing marketing can be. And I think trying to make sure, and I actually have questions to, I'm very curious to talk with different regulators and, you know, decision makers to figure out how can we ensure better truth in marketing here? Because I've had people come to my door and, you know, and I feel bad for them because I ask so many questions. But you know, they're making a pitch, and they maybe they even think they're being accurate when they're talking about safety, when they're talking about it being derived from, you know, derived from chrysanthemum flowers. And I always have to kind of push back and ask more questions. So I don't know what the mechanism is for policy, but I do feel like there is room to make sure that we have there's greater clarity when someone comes to your door and is suggesting that you should get, you know, a treatment in your yard for different, and that it would be safe. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it's a really good question. I think it's something we need to explore, especially seeing just how high the levels are in those yards.
I was thinking about the example that Aaron gave with the video of this person's neighbor spraying. And I did dawn on me that that must have been a lot of work to get that tested and then, you know, talk to the company and figure out what they could do to hold this company accountable and then talking to that neighbor. But it was effective that they stopped spraying altogether. I think that's a really incredible example of just having these conversations of like, hey, did you know these chemicals are coming into my yard? And people are busy. And if they're not thinking about it, they might just think like, oh, what I'm doing is good.
Yeah.
But having the conversations with neighbors can be really, really impactful. I really appreciate that you shared that story, Erin. It was quite inspiring.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah, and I think it is an example of how often people, yeah, might just not be aware of some of these issues and might just be doing the convenient thing or, maybe are being influenced by, some of the marketing that we were just discussing. And when, you have a constructive conversation with them, they're happy to change their ways. I think that's the ideal outcome. I know lots of times it's a lot trickier than that, but I think that, kind of going in with that open mind and discussing. I think, yeah, and it sounds like the person who shared the story did it in a wonderful way, but not being accusatory, not being like, how dare you be spraying this in my yard, but just being like, hey, this is what I'm doing in my yard. This is why I'm trying to be pesticide free. Did you know that this is? Yeah, I think that there's ways you can do this that are constructive and can hopefully move the needle.
Listening to this, I had one other thought, which is also like the example that Aaron gave from Boulder. And when you have a municipality that is engaged and interested and really thoughtful about how they, and starting early in the season and already being prepared and monitoring and surveilling for disease and communicating with the neighbors and the whole community to make a difference, that's really where we can see the change. And actually in Massachusetts, there was legislation that was attempted in order to have funding at the state level that could be released to the local levels to ensure ecologically responsible practices. Because if you're a small area, you might not have the same funding base. But if you start at the state level and they provide the resources and the ability so that all the local communities don't just wait to the last minute and react when there's a disease problem and a lot of mosquitoes in the area and people are concerned and risk and fear are both high, but actually when we can start early from a community. So I think maybe even more important than making sure we have truth in marketing is also really making sure that disease management and vector control they have the funding that they need in order to be ecologically responsible, and the tools and the knowledge to be able to carry that out. Because it does, initially can cost more to do that, to get things set up to be able to monitor and be prepared. Down the road, it saves you money because you're saving disease concerns. But
Yes, really just highlights how important this work is, which brings us to our very last question. Teresa would also like to thank you so much for this critical work, and then asks, did they hear correctly that a paper is being published on this research? And if so, they would love to have access to it.
Yes, we have submitted it to a journal for publication and it's currently under review. So fingers crossed, assuming all goes relatively well, hopefully in the next few months, we'll have a version out that we can send links to. So we'll definitely let people know as soon as that's available.
Thank you so much, Erin and Amay. This was a great presentation. Get lots of praise in the chat and the Q&A. So thank you for doing this study and taking the initiative. And thank you to everybody who participated, if anybody here was part of that. But yeah, we have questions about the recording. It will be probably up on YouTube by Friday, I think, maybe Monday. So I just put the link to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe. All of our webinars and lots of great content is there as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Amber, for co-hosting with me. And yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.